Well, I have a college story to start us off with. It gets kind of heavy, so I want to start with light note, maybe hard to believe, but in college I was even more handsome than I am now. Nancy and I were together way back then, and everyone in our small on-campus dorm knew we were a couple. A handsome one at that, obviously. I also played intramural sports on campus and around the dorm, so it was pretty obvious that I was pretty good at sports, which actually I was back then, believe it or not. And I mention all this to make the point that while it really should not have mattered at all, by all appearances in my youth, I looked like a stereotypical heterosexual male, and I pretty much was one, except for one thing. I didn't know it, I couldn't have imagined it, but despite the reality of my heterosexualness to a gang in the dorm, I was gay because I was in plays. To them, being a drama major meant homosexuality, and we complain about science education today. Whether I was gay or not shouldn't have mattered, but to them, gays were cultural lepers who needed to stay away from the world or be crushed. And it made no sense, but homophobia never does. And at first, the gang made crude comments to me in the halls, and then began yelling and banging on things outside my dorm room, especially late at night. Eventually, they became physically violent, shoving me into walls when we passed each other in the halls. I didn't fight back. I didn't turn them in for fears that things would escalate. But they escalated anyway. When gay bashing, epithet-laden death threats were put in my dorm mailbox, I took counterintuitive action. Actually, I kind of snapped judgment-wise. I saw the gang playing touch football on the dorm's lawn, and I asked if I could play, and I joined in on the non-gang side of the field. And on the first play, the gang leader lined up against me, and at the height, threw a series of gut punches. I took the punches. And then at the end of the play, as he walked back to the huddle, I asked in my booming theater voice why he had to cheat. Was he afraid he couldn't win against the gay drama guy playing fair? And with the gauntlet of fairness thrown down and everyone watching, the gang had to play by the rules, and they lost. In part because the gay drama guy could play touch football pretty well. And after that, no one bothered me or the other male drama major in the dorm. It makes no sense, but touch football took away our untouchableness. And I was fortunate. I could have been seriously hurt by that gang of football, on campus, in the dorm, on the streets of the town. Gay bashers are a very violent lot. So make no mistake about it, I was lucky, and the threats were very real. After that other drama major in the dorm left for graduate school, he was severely beaten by a student who perceived him at that college as gay, even though he was also a heterosexual, which should not have mattered, and also evidences the ridiculousness and the rabid nature of hate and homophobia. Violence against gays and perceived gays has a long and sordid history in this country that continues to this day. As mentioned in other sermons in the past year, some religious leaders in this area and one from another state have gone out of their way to confront me with ugly, mean, hateful words for just saying or writing things along the lines of this sermon, which ironically have all been grounded in Jesus' teachings. I know too that some religious folks in the area perceive me as an apostasy and or gay, think of me as an outcast. To this day, I remain a socially constructed leper to a gang of homophobic religious people. But the confrontations I've had are nothing compared to the way in which LGBTQ plus folks are abused, bullied, and violently treated by such ungodly gangs. Last year in America, there were at least 57 transgender or gender non-conforming people fatally shot or killed by other violent means. A few weeks ago, 6th anniversary of the shooting in an Orlando LGBTQ nightclub that killed 49 people and injured 53. Also, a few weeks ago, a gang of men were arrested planning violence at a peaceful pride parade in Idaho. And this isn't an out-of-state issue. A recent study noted that state laws in Ohio also fail to adequately protect LGBT students from bullying and harassment. Polling in the report indicated that nearly 25% of LGBTQ plus high schoolers experience bullying in school, twice that of straight students. And it doesn't seem to get better in college. In one Ohio college, 39% of the transgender students experience exclusionary, intimidating, offensive, or hostile conduct on campus. Homophobic-driven violence is still happening. And some of the awful stories of violence against LGBTQ plus make the press, but most of the time they don't, like my recent encounters, my college story, my friend in graduate school, and many of your stories, and countless others that are out there. If you don't seem to fit into the gender boxes that some in our culture want to put us in, there's reason to fear. In college, being in drama for me meant being abused and threatened. It was awful. To use a phrase from last week's sermon, it was unnerving. But I didn't have to endure it long, or relatively much. What if I were gay? How many folks in our community would think it fair to treat me even more violently and meaner than I have been for LGBTQ justice? Like I was treated in college. If it's not right, or unfair, or ridiculous to harass a drama major or a clergy person who opposes injustice, why isn't it just as preposterous that loving someone of your own gender makes a person so hated? Why should being LGBTQ plus by God make anyone acceptable and outside the norm? Such norms are constructed by our culture. They're certainly not God's norms. Nor are they universal cultural norms. LGBTQ plus are considered acceptable elsewhere. And this isn't new. It's not a liberal plot. In the 1950s, a survey of 190 societies around the world reported homosexual practices were considered acceptable behavior in approximately 7%. In the 1950s. Why? In the 21st century, are LGBTQ unacceptable to some and treated as socially constructed lepers in America? Homophobic people connected to churches across the country might answer, the Bible condemns homosexuality. That's what a number of religious elites might claim, the Dr. Dobsons and Pat Robertsons of the world, as well as not so famous hateful religious people we have probably all encountered. And it's pretty interesting how obsessed they are with this claim. You might think it was at the heart of the Gospels, but it's not even in the Gospels. Jesus did not say a word about homosexuality. It is interesting, though, that the Gospels report Jesus opposed divorce and asserted remarriage after divorce as adultery. So why don't we hear ranting and raving about the divorce by the religious elite who hate LGBTQ people while thumping their Bibles? Why are there anti-LGBTQ plus bills in legislatures, but no bills to keep the divorce or marrying again, so the state does not sponsor biblical adultery? And the short answer is that our culture's not ancient Israel. Our culture accepts divorce and remarriage as a part of our norm. Ancient divorce rules no longer apply. We decided such rules have no place in our culture. It's not just biblical prohibitions against divorce. The Bible has numerous prohibitions meant only to apply to ancient Israel that we don't follow. We don't hear LGBTQ plus haters thumping their Bibles about those other prohibitions. How many of us today are wearing mixed fibers? I am. How many of us in shape today? I did. How many of us have eaten pork or rabbit or shellfish? How many of us have played and touched pigskin playing football? If we've done these things, applying ancient Israel biblical standards, we are unclean, like lepers, who were not in ancient Israel. So we don't enforce those prohibitions. Pat Robertson and James Dobson both shame, but they in their churches and many others oppose homosexuality on the basis of the same types of purported prohibitions that they violate when they shave. And if shaving is not prohibited anymore, then why? It's homosexuality. The Bible and ancient Israel's laws do not make LGBTQ wrong in this day and age. Religious people opposing LGBTQ plus are just picking and choosing verses that they want to enforce on others. If they weren't picking and choosing, they'd be going after the divorced, and the pork eaters, and the clam chowder makers, and the people in continental blends, and all men who shave. One of the many ironies of Bible thumping against LGBTQ plus is that not one word of the Bible was ever meant to condemn homosexuality in our culture. Not one word. And you may be thinking of verses that have words you are sure condemn homosexuality, but guess what? The word homosexual is not in the original versions of the Bible or even in the King James Version. You see, scientific study of sexuality is barely a century old. To read the word homosexuality into the Bible is as anachronistic as translating scroll to mean laptop computer. Ancient Israel, of course, knew about same-gender sensuality, but not homosexuality. Homosexuality relates to relationships. This isn't semantics. Verses in the Bible that deal with sensuality were never intended as prohibitions against loving, consensual relationships, let alone made with awareness of the laws of science. Moreover, the texts most relied on by homophobic religious folks are specifically tied to the land of Israel. We are not in Israel. Every verse relied on to claim homosexuality in America is prohibited can be fairly interpreted in a loving way to say nothing about it. There's a hateful way to read it, but it's not necessary to or Christ-like to do so. Many of the prohibitions in the Bible were created for reasons which existed in ancient Israel. They're not applicable in America, which is why you don't hear Dr. Dobson, Pat Robertson, and other homophobic Christians advocating that all Americans must live by the verses that are anti-shaving, anti-pork eating, anti-clam chowder, anti-mixed fibers, and anti-divorce. The same reason that there is no reason to apply those verses is why there's no reason to apply purportedly anti-homosexual texts from ancient Israel to modern America. And if all that was not enough to do away with homophobia for churchgoers, in the story that we heard John read so well from Matthew 8, Jesus models how his followers should deal with those the culture names and oppresses as unclean. A leper who was an outcast by social constructs and scriptures of ancient Israel told Jesus, if you choose, you can make me clean. And Jesus' response was to stretch out his hand and touch the outcast and state authoritatively, I do choose, be made clean. Jesus ignored the social constructs of his day and scriptural prohibitions against lepers. Jesus did this by recognizing and claiming the culturally unclean as clean. He touched the untouchable and declares them touchable. That's powerful healing for outcasts. And this should not surprise us. Jesus taught us that loving God and others outranks every other commandment, outranks them all of them. Jesus touches the untouchable in violation of norms and Scripture because loving others requires that. For Jesus' love must wash away any and all constructs that make another unclean, whether a person is a leper, literally or figuratively. No one is unclean. All are goodly and godly made by God. And we are called to do as Jesus did, not just hear his stories and praise him. And to do as Jesus did includes affirmatively taking away social constructs that make people outcasts. To follow Jesus, we need to choose to make the culturally unclean clean. We need to touch the untouchables and declare them touchable just as God made them. We need to reject norms that outcast others, and we need to go out of the way to embrace those who are outcast by any part of the culture. Loving our neighbors includes declaring our culture's unclean clean and welcoming them just as they are, fully and equally into the community of God. This is Christ's community, not the culture. Jesus himself calls us to such a daring reaching out, welcoming, and opening community. And the book of Acts evidences the early church did just that when an Ethiopian eunuch, an LGBTQ plus person, was sought out and invited and welcomed into the church. And the book of Acts even notes that God codified this with a command to Peter that no one is to be called unclean or profane. If churches can welcome Pat Robertson and James Dodson who shave, if churches can welcome Donald Trump and others who've been divorced and remarried, if churches can welcome theater people like me, then churches can welcome all other lepers our culture creates, including every single LGBTQ plus person, each of whom is goodly and godly made. As Pride Month comes to a close, I wanted to make it clear that the radical, open, and affirming nature of this church is very Jesus-like, very Christian, and has biblical anchors. No matter where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here as a goodly and godly made person. And you are loved, and you